to Darth Vader music, but you know what? I'm really not that shocked at all. So first off, thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for people watching this online. But I think the biggest thank you goes to Dr. Walter Block over there, and I actually brought this. This was from about, I'd say 5 years ago. I organized a lecture for the good doctor at Columbia, and he did sign the book saying, "Thank you, Charles, for assembling this." And he actually took it back with him and later mailed it to me again. But I did not write a book called The Great Bill Weld, but if I do, I will send you a mailed copy. So going into the first topic of just like libertarianism as a whole, I think we have to talk before we say Murray Rothbard or Milton Friedman. We have to sort of get our philosopher on and say another great libertarian, Ayn Rand. And she would always just combat things with four simple questions which were fundamental to how humans confront any problem. Who are we? Where are we? How did we get here? And now what, and what now? Who are we? We're libertarians. What is libertarianism? It is the platform of you own yourself and nobody can regulate that. Nobody can say you can't smoke marijuana, nobody can interrupt your phone calls, no one can disturb commerce. But if you're going to hurt someone, it's going to be a problem. If you're going to regulate something, it's going to be a problem. We all understand that. That's the basic thing right here. But where we go past that in the debate, I feel, is we have this, I don't want to debate the topic so much of what is libertarianism, because I think that's well established. I think it's more of, at this point, you see someone like Friedman, you see someone like Rothbard, you see Gary Johnson, you see Ron Paul, and you just get all of these topics where it comes to a point where it's not so much they disagree, but it's how to do it. So where are we right now? We're in the loser circle. In 2008, Ron Paul ran up against the guy who looked like Skeletor, some mayor who never shut up about 9/11, and some guy named Huckabee, and got 5%. He got 10% going up against a religious fundamentalist from Pennsylvania, the Mormon version of Hillary Clinton, and then some guy named Newt. And 2016, we have Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, two-term governors, go up against Biff Tannen from the Back to the Future movies, and Granny Nixon, and he gets 3-4%. So we've lost badly the last 3 elections, and I look back in history. Calvin Coolidge was maybe not a libertarian in definition, but pro-free market, pro-civil liberties, not a huge interventionist. Maybe not that great on immigration, but overall pretty good. You go to Robert Taft in the Senate, who was the Republican Senate Majority Leader, almost was the president, he wins. You look at Barry Goldwater, got the Republican nomination, but then after that it dies, and it seems the liberty movement just became sort of what the conservative movement is now, and that's owned by a guy who, quite frankly, is, I would say Donald Trump, and I'd say insane. Anti-trade, anti-immigrant, anti-civil liberties on many fronts. It doesn't work. So we're in the loser circle. How did we get here? You know, I would say libertarianism originates from classical liberalism in basic principle. We go to the 15th century, we look at that, and we say, okay, the 15th century existed with the shipping industry. We had, for the first time, people do all this international trade, and they sort of govern themselves to the first degree. So libertarianism, classical liberalism, call it what you want. It transpirals through history, American Revolution, the Constitution, go to the 20s, go to the New Deal, the Progressive Era, we get the 50s, and libertarianism is coined, and I'll say it, Murray Rothbard probably was the one to coin the term, so he does get some rights on that. But we got to a place where we just lose every election, and we have right now 2 million people in jail for the war on drugs. We have globally, like we have fiat currency where inflation is expected, and we're losing. So how did we get here? I don't know the answer to that right away. I think maybe just the message of promising free stuff or promising to hate people wins. But what do we do now? What I'm just going to say from this debate, I'm going to say pragmatism, and I'm going to say instead of perhaps going hard on anarchy, going hard on this direct front of libertarianism and a philosophical front, we discuss things issue by issue, and we act a lot more like my man Milton Friedman, and also my man Bill Weld. So I think that is the point, and I think the good doctor deserves his next stop right here.
congruent with that. What are these planks? One is the non-aggression principle. Keep your mitts to yourself. Don't grab other people or their property without their permission. Boxing is okay because you agree to be punched, and if somebody punches you in the jaw, if you're in the boxing match, you can't sue him for assault and battery because you agree to be punched above the bell. So that would be one element of libertarianism, the non-aggression principle. The second one would be private property rights, because here's a young man, he's got a MAGA hat on, and suppose I go over to him and I grab the hat off of his head. Have I now interfered with his, have I been an aggressor? Have I violated the non-aggression principle? Well, it all depends upon who is the legitimate owner of the hat. If he stole it from me yesterday, then he's the criminal, even though today I'm grabbing. On the other hand, it's his hat. I didn't see that hat before, so I'd be the criminal if I grabbed it. So we need some sort of theory of property rights, and libertarians go along with John Locke and Murray Rothbard and Hans Hoppe, who have done more than any other three people to establish property rights. And the third is free association. The only problem with rape and slavery is there's no free association. The rape victim doesn't want to associate with the rapist. The slave doesn't want to associate with the master, and yet is forced to. So free association is also very important. And anarcho-libertarians, such as Murray Rothbard, are sound as a bell on all three. Indeed, are almost the creators of this, as I will argue that Murray Rothbard really created the modern libertarian movement. So I place anarcho-capitalism at the top of the heap. Second down would come minarchism, or minimal government libertarianism. And here the two people most heavily associated with it are Ayn Rand and, what's his name from Harvard, Robert Nozick. And the idea here is government should exist, whereas for the anarcho-capitalists, government is a per se violation of the non-aggression principle and shouldn't exist because they compel you to pay taxes and they order you around even though you didn't agree to be ordered. But in the minimal government libertarian view, there is a legitimate government and has only one function, and that is to uphold the non-aggression principle. Of course, if they tax you, they're sort of violating it, but what the heck? Can't have everything. And to that end, we need three institutions to protect person and property. And one is armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, not to go exporting democracy, but to just defend the country. Second, local police to keep local bad guys off of us, not to have victimless criminals, but just stopping assault and murder and rape. And third, courts to decide who the good guys and the bad guys are. Third, down in the list, is constitutionalists, and the most famous one is Ron Paul. And the view here is whatever the Constitution says, but not as interpreted by modern people, but interpreted the way they meant it when they wrote it. And the Constitution is pretty good, so I consider them the third group of libertarians. And then the fourth, I'm a big tent kind of a guy, so I include what I call the fourth group, and that's classical liberals. And the most famous classical liberals are Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. And they are free enterprisers, but they have all sorts of compromises with the non-aggression principle and private property rights and free association. Also, they favor welfare, they favor this, they favor that. But they are sort of free enterprises, so as a big tent kind of a guy, I include them. And I would say, just roughly, if I had to categorize the number of people in each group of libertarians, I would say it's 10, 30, and 30. 10, 30, 30, and 30. 10 anarcho-capitalists, 10%. 30% for the other three. So anarcho-capitalists are in a little bit of the minority. Now let me comment on a little bit of what Charles said. He said, you own yourself. Well, magnificent. I think he's being converted to Rothbardianism because only Rothbard would say you own yourself and be consistent about it. Ayn Rand wouldn't, Ron Paul wouldn't, certainly Milton Friedman wouldn't. You own yourself means you can't is my time up?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I'll get him more later.
Oh, the mic. So now we want to go over the chair. I mean, you kind of touched on it.
10 minutes on.
Yeah. On libertarianism, and Charles Peralo will begin.
Well, that I'm being converted to Rothbardism, but I've been just told that there's a live stream going on, and the comments say I have a bowl cut. So I'm tempted to wear in that man's hat right now that says "Make America Great Again" to hide my hair. So maybe I'm being converted to something else. So there's a couple interesting points here I'd like to just go down. Regarding anarcho-capitalism, I don't normally associate that much with libertarianism. I think the issue with anarcho-capitalism is anarchy is anarchy, libertarianism is libertarianism. Libertarianism is a view you own yourself and you own your property, and there is this thing called the non-aggression principle, but there's this belief in that government will be the thing to be allowed to have some aggression to prevent aggression. And there are many schools on that, there's privatization there. But regarding anarcho-capitalism, my issue with it really just stems from the fact that I don't think it'll work. I look at anarcho-capitalism and I say, okay, the 13th century, Scotland, there was, I believe, a society in Scotland where you were given 35 tribes that you were allowed to live in. And of those 35 tribes, basically you decided, and it's a different model for government. That deteriorated with trade and so on, where other nations came in and they had to form a formal defense. So on a foreign policy perspective, for anarcho-capitalism to work, it would really not, I think the best way to say it is it would really not be effective in a global environment where other people are not anarcho-capitalists. And the next thing with anarcho-capitalism is that of these 35 societies, I feel where it just creates a situation where people are going to hire a government. Government is going to act as something that works with almost a religion and less of something the government that gets represented by land. And I look at that and I just don't see a model there that works. I see a model where confusion that is going to happen. Now, could government end? You know, Bitcoin, I think Bitcoin has the opportunity to end government control of monetary policy. I look at drones and I say, what if we could, in our phones, push a button and as easily as using Uber, get a drone security, basically ending the need for a public police. I look at 3D printing and molecular printing and say, you know what, if you want your heroin, it'll be printed. If you want your cancer medication the FDA is denying you from, that can be printed. I look at 3D printing and say, if you want your AK-47, it can be printed. So I do think there is a chance where government could be replaced by technology, but I don't view that as much of a political front. Now, we're looking at libertarianism and the three other tiers he named. So minarchism, you know, that probably is where I think the definite ends of libertarianism exist, and I think that's the ideal ends. In minarchism, Medicare doesn't exist. Social Security doesn't exist. The government would probably go from hiring maybe, I believe they hire now 14 million people, to probably just defense and probably a greatly reduced fence, so maybe 400,000 people. So going from 14 million to 400,000 is what we discuss. And I believe from that front, probably skip constitutionalism. Constitutionalism has this front where you're going to talk about the state, you're going to talk about local governments. I would say go to a local town hall meeting. It's probably the biggest corruption of government that makes Washington, D.C. look effective. It's a disaster zone. So I look at that and say skip constitutionalism. Let's go from pragmatism, classical liberalism, and then go to minarchism. So doing that, you have to go from 14 million to 400,000. You have to go from 2 million people into jail to about 200,000 people in jail. You have to go from the government spending $4 trillion a year just on the federal level to probably about $500 billion. That's not easy, and that takes pragmatic thought and principle right there. So how does that get handled? I'm going to say a method that we're not seeing in the liberty movement so far, and the method does not have Make America Great Again in it. It's not a method where you say you're going to sacrifice your views on libertarianism, say, oh, because Trump is better on foreign policy, arguably, we're going to embrace anti-trade views, we're going to embrace deporting 20 million people. I'm going to say the answer is embrace Bill Weld, embrace Gary Johnson, embrace a view where you're going to say, we're going to try and cut the government 15%, we're going to try and cut it 20%. And I look at the 4 libertarians who've run in the last year who had online following. The first was Rand Paul, who I supported. Rand Paul said we were going to balance the budget over a course of 5 years. That implied he was going to cut the government about 5% and let tax revenue grow, the economy grow another 5% or 15%, and that works. And then the next libertarian was Gary Johnson. Gary Johnson came out originally in 2012 saying he wanted to cut the government 43%, then he dropped it to 25%, and that became the Johnson Wealth campaign right there. Then there was Austin Peterson, who supported the penny plan, who ran this year. I think because Liberty Hangout is the one streaming this, many of his friends are going to be commenting on that, but hello, Austin. And the next is John McAfee, who, when I interviewed McAfee actually with Liberty Hangout a year ago, he was the one who I thought had the best plan to cut government, which was hire people, which was basically keep paying people and telling them not to work, go find other jobs. So that approach, it sounds a little crazy, but what sounds crazier, giving people money for the next 5 years to go out and do other things, or going out and just firing them flat out and having them riot and burn things down in a way that would make Ferguson, Berkeley, or whatever crisis you're talking about look like nothing. So there's just this method here, and I see libertarianism, personal property. Of course we own ourselves. And in that responsibility, I think we agree on a government, we agree on a piece of land that is going to have a representation, and the ideal representation of that is force to end force. I believe that is libertarianism. But then there's this whole process where I feel like we're bashing people, and one thing is I feel like Dr. Block does wrong, and I think a lot of libertarians do wrong, is being more libertarian than someone does not make you better than they are. I feel like we have this situation where it's like, oh, you're that libertarian? Well, guess what? Not only do I favor privatizing the roads, but I'm gonna own the roads, or something silly like that. And it's like, and I feel like there's this score count, like I'm more capitalist, and the liberals do what the conservatives do, but the libertarians have hit that to the extreme. They've gone nuts with that, and I just think that is our problem right there. So I don't think that there's much more to talk about on this subject. Libertarianism is indeed personal responsibility. It is the NAP, but it's just how do you apply the NAP? And I think that is from some form of a government, and I think anarcho-capitalism is anarcho-capitalism, libertarianism is libertarianism. And I hope I gave you some fuel for the fire in your segment. Did I?
There's a joke. There was a red car, and they were in front of the judge, and the green car guy said, "The red car hit me." And the judge said, "Yes, you're right." Then the red car guy got up and said, "The green car hit me." And the judge said, "Yes, you're right." And then somebody from the courtroom said, "How can you say that? First you say the green car is innocent, then you say the red car is innocent. It can't be both." And you know what the judge says? "You're right also." The point is, if you commit a self-contradiction, it's sort of a problem. Logical consistency is sort of the, I won't say the be-all and end-all of everything, but it's the necessary condition, and yet Mr. Peralo is contradicting himself all over the place. He says that we should have aggression to prevent aggression. Well, come on. I mean, if you're against initiatory aggression and you stop initiatory aggression by initiating aggression, you're contradicting yourself. I mean, it's sort of hard to argue with people who contradict themselves because, you know, pretty soon they'll say A is not A, or 2 plus 2 is not 4, or something. It's very difficult. Then he says, we'll use force to end force. Come on. I mean, if you're against initiatory force, you can't use initiatory force to end initiatory force. Then he reiterates, you own yourself. Now, here he's magnificent. This is the essence of libertarianism. You own yourself, and this is, therefore, we agree on government. Wow, that's pretty fast. It went right by me. I own myself means you can't grab me or my property without my permission. And you come along with a gun, and you're the IRS, and you say, hey, you know, we need $500 billion that he supports. And, you know, I'm willing to call this libertarianism, but sort of just by being a nice guy. In my heart of hearts, the only consistent libertarians are the anarcho-capitalists. Whereas the way he sees it, the only consistent libertarians are the minarchists, maybe the constitutionalists and the classical liberals. No, it's the very opposite. The only consistent libertarians are anarcho-capitalists. Now look, we did have this thing called the Dallas Accord. The Dallas Accord was created in the LP because the anarchists and libertarians were fighting with each other. And what they said is, look, you know, first let's reduce government by down to 5% or 10% of what it is, and then we'll fight. And so within the LP, I think that's a good idea for the LP, that we all work together. But this is not the LP, although I support the LP. This is a philosophical discussion. And on this philosophical discussion, I say, the only logical, consistent libertarian, if you agree that you own yourself, and he says that you own yourself, and he repeated it a second time, and then he contradicts himself by supporting government. You can't have it both ways. You can't say the green car is right and the red car is right, and that the judge who says that both are right is also right. That's just a blatant contradiction. He says that libertarianism isn't doing too well. I was converted by Ayn Rand in 1963 to libertarianism, and then I was converted by Murray Rothbard in 1966 to anarchism, free market anarchism. And I asked Murray, how many libertarians are there in the world? This is 1966, and he said 25. Well, we've got more than 25 people in this small group. You know, the gays say we are everywhere. We libertarians, we're everywhere. So in one sense, I agree with Mr. Peralo. You know, we're not doing too well. We haven't formed the government, God forbid, but what the heck. We're not a power in the land. The Libertarian Party gets 1 or 3% of the vote, and only 3 because the two candidates, Hillary and Donald, were so reviled by everyone. The usual Libertarian vote is about 1%. So in some sense, we're not doing too well, and in another sense, we're doing very, very well. And you know, if you're an optimist or a pessimist, you can see the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. Taxes are coercive. Taxes are a violation of the non-aggression principle. Taxes are a violation of the idea that you own yourself. If you really own yourself and somebody comes along and says you have to, am I out of time already?
10 minutes? 10 minutes?
That was 10 minutes?
I don't think that was 10
Oh,
minutes.
No.
sorry, maybe I made a mistake, sorry.
Also, I'm waiting for you to say taxation instead.
What about that $100 I gave you to let me speak? Give me my 100 back.
We're gonna fire our timekeeper.
Okay, fire him, or tell him to give me extra time or something, I don't know. Taxes are coercive. Taxes are a necessary concomitant of government, and if you favor taxes, you can't say with a straight face that you own yourself, unless you contemplate self-contradiction. Look, Mr. Peralo says that it wouldn't work. Well, right now there's a state of anarchy between countries. Canada and Chile are in a state of anarchy with each other. Namely, there's no world government. Burundi and Brazil are in a state of anarchy with each other. Every other country is in a state of anarchy with every other country. So if you say it can't work, what you're really saying is we need world government. Well, world government is a problem. I mean, if we had a democratic world government, China and India, between them, would pretty much run things. And nobody really likes that. I'm Jewish. We Jews keep running away from different people. There'd be no place to run. I mean, Mars is not yet habitable, although maybe we'll get there. But I think it's working fine, anarchy between countries. Now, the whole idea is that if we didn't have a government, Lewis and I might get into a fight, and therefore we need a government to make sure that Lewis and I behave. Well, on that logic, we need a world government to make sure Chile and Canada don't get into a fight. Notice my beautiful alliteration: China, Chile, Burundi, Brazil. Isn't that great? Another point is secession. Look, we have a thing called free association. Recently, there was a florist and a photographer and a baker, and a gay couple went to each of them and said, "Hey, we're having a wedding. Please, serve as our photographer or as our florist or as our baker." And they said, "No, we're Christians and we don't really want to do that." And they were going to put him in jail almost. They fined the baker $130,000. That's a violation of free association. And this is a strong part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which lefties favored and people who call themselves libertarians favored, and Mr. Peralo favors. And this is a violation of the law of free association. Compelling people to associate with one another against their will is a blatant violation of libertarian philosophy. He says we should hire a government. Yes, we should hire a government. But that means we should agree to it. And if we agree to it, it couldn't be called government, because government is the thing that you don't agree to. We need another word. It's called private defense agencies. Yes, I agree. Let's hire a private defense agency. Let's hire a court. Let's hire people. All action should be voluntary. No one should coerce anyone else. And yet this man stands there and tells us that you own yourself, and yet he favors all this sort of stuff. This is a philosophical monstrosity. Yes, he says that technology and Bitcoin might get rid of the FDA, might get rid of the Fed or whatever it is. Well, fine, but he's contradicting himself again. He keeps contradicting himself. And I've got a few other examples because he wrote these things that Lewis mentioned. Something libertarians must admit, Murray Rothbard sucked. A very elegant way of putting matters. I have these things in front of me, and he's roughly the age of my students, a little older, but I'm a professor and I have term papers, and I'm sort of looking at this stuff as if it was a term paper, and I'm trying to think of, what grade would I give it? And I tell you, I would give it an A++ for courage. He is a magnificently courageous young man, and I applaud him for that. He comes to this group, which is the Rothbardian Circle. He writes this stuff, which, a lot of libertarians revere Murray Rothbard, so I give him an A+ for courage. But you can't have self-contradictions. For example, he says over here, a libertarian such as my mega superhero Ron Paul. Mega superhero Ron Paul. And then on another page, guess what he says about my man Ron? He says that, where is it? Here it is. Really, Ron Paul, why do all libertarians seem to have a scam, cash for gold business? Sort of denigrating this superhero of his. And then he said, I've met at least over a dozen libertarians who are literally watching these joke podcasts. So he's saying that Ron Paul is guilty of joke podcasts? After saying that Ron Paul is, let me repeat that, mega superhero. Yeah. And then what does he say? That one more contradiction. The age of Ron Paul is dead, and he's exulting in this. He's not reporting this. So he's contradicting himself with Ron Paul, and he also does the same thing with Tom Woods. What does he do with Tom Woods? He says, I actually do like Tom Woods. And then what does he say about Tom Woods? He says that Tom Woods is a joke, and Tom Woods was criticizing his screed. And he says, I've met at least 2 dozen libertarians who are literally watching these joke podcasts from Tom Woods, Peter Schiff, and Ron Paul. So again, he's contradicting himself. And if this was a term paper from a student of mine, I'd say, hey, look, you can't say that the green car was right and that the red car was right and that the judge who said both are right is also right. You have to make up your bloody mind. You just can't be all over the lot. And this is just, one little, 2 little essays that he wrote, and they're just contradictions all over the place. But again, these are minor contradictions.